And okay, hello to all, and a very warm welcome from the Fortunius Society in Macau. And it's wonderful to have all of you join our webinar today. And I'm your moderator, Davis. I study diplomacy at SOAS University of London, and I work at University of Macau now. We all of us know that earlier this year, in September, Queen Elizabeth II passed away after a 7-year reign that began in 1952. And her death obviously has not only drawn worldwide attentions and reactions, but also a debate about her legacy, the legacy of the British Empire, future of the UK, and also the future of other Commonwealth countries, especially those still have the British monarch as their head of state. And today we are very delighted to welcome Professor Priscilla Mary Roberts from City University of Macau as our speaker. Professor Roberts is a leading historian in the field of Anglo-American and Western Asian relations, as well as in the history of foreign policy. And today she will be talking about Britain and the world after Queen Elizabeth II. I think she will talk about, among other things, the global reactions to the Queen's passing, the impact on the UK, and where we see some new development on the questions of Scottish independence earlier today, as well as the impacts on other Commonwealth nations, especially the other 14, which today still have King Charles as their monarch. And without further ado, I would like now want to give the floor to Professor Roberts, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that warm and generous introduction, and also for inviting me back to speak here for a second time. It's very nice to see some old friends in the audience, as well as some new faces. I was obviously affected by the death in September, just about 11 weeks ago, of Queen Elizabeth II. It's more than 3 years since I was last in the UK, but I am British. She was my queen, and indeed the only queen whom I, along with most of the population of Great Britain and indeed the world, the only British queen that we can remember. And her death and funeral really do seem to have been not just a British event, though they were certainly that, but also to have marked a national and global milestone. I'd also been doing some research on Henry James, the Anglo-American novelist who lived in London and in Britain for many years. And so I was very familiar with what he had said about the death of Queen Victoria at the very beginning of 1901. That was perhaps even more symbolic because it marked the beginning of a new century, as well as the ending of what I think was then the longest reigning monarch the British had ever known, certainly the longest reigning queen. So the Queen's death was certainly a symbol of the ending of an era, perhaps particularly the era of the World War II generation. She's obviously not quite the last surviving person in the world to have seen service served in the military in World War II, but she was certainly one of a dwindling number of people who actually saw some kind of service in that conflict. She was also a woman of immense stamina and vitality. I would say that that is one characteristic that many members of the British royal family seem to almost have bred into them. Enormous energy, enormous stamina, the ability to keep going when most of us would only want to put our feet up, whether at the end of a long day, a long week, or even a long life. She was determined to keep going for as long as she could. And we saw that in particular when 2 days before she died, she met with Boris Johnson, the outgoing Prime Minister, and then Liz Truss, the incoming Prime Minister. Less than 60 hours later, she had passed away. A rather speedy death, obviously, which perhaps many people would envy her. Now, I was rather struck by the idea that in the 185 years since 1837, 2 female British monarchs reigned for a total of 134 years between them. Queen Victoria, the Queen's great-great-grandmother, and Elizabeth II, so that for almost 2 centuries, it does seem to me that having a female monarch in charge has been almost the default mode, because there have been many more male monarchs than female monarchs. We perhaps have not quite adjusted to the idea that male sovereigns have been much shorter lived than their female equivalents. I've got here the 4 kings who reigned for the 51 years between the 2 queens: Edward VII, George V, very briefly Edward VIII, and then his brother, the Queen's father, to whom she was devoted, and frequently referred her own father, George VI. What I was also struck by was how in recent years, and I haven't got all the photos here, there's also a famous one of the Queen and the 3 next heirs to the throne, the Prince of Wales, King Charles III, as he now is, the then Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge, and his son, Prince George, all stirring a Christmas pudding. I think that was probably 2 Christmases back. Here we have a picture of Queen Victoria, her son, who would later become Edward VII, his heir, George V, then the Duke of York, and the then 3rd in line to the throne, who would later become, very briefly, Edward VIII. So there has been a deliberate attempt to provide the same kind of images, rather touchingly. George, though very short, is standing here on what I think is a pile of books, getting the message across that the succession to the throne is assured for the next 3 generations. In 1901, the beginning of a new century, for many, Queen Victoria, as with our Queen, the only Queen most of her subjects in Britain and beyond could remember, seemed likewise to mark the beginning of a new and perhaps frightening era. It's symbolic that the weather was very cold, the rains snapped, the horses reared, and the new king, Edward VII, began a new tradition whereby sovereigns' funeral carriages were drawn by naval ratings rather than horses. The novelist Henry James, watching her funeral from a friend's house in Buckingham Gate, thought it far away the most imposing public function I've ever seen. And he reported to an American friend then living in Venice, how strange is the feeling that the door is closed on the past 60 years and that we've faced about another way altogether, or if not quite perhaps altogether, enough to feed greatly suspense and curiosity. For him, the Queen's death marked the end of an epoch, perhaps symbolizing the growing weakness of the British Empire, as demonstrated in the then still ongoing Boer War, which he and his brother William James in the United States had followed with great attention, and in Henry James' case, with growing apprehension and unhappiness. In fact, Henry James blamed the Queen's death in part upon the worries caused by the war. For him, the prospects for the future under Edward VII, whom he considered a playboy and arch vulgarian, seemed pretty grim. He didn't think much of the successors but one, whom he referred to as the wretched little Yorks, otherwise known as the future King George V and Queen Mary, and thought less than nothing. He said that the Queen's magnificent duration has held things magnificently, beneficently together and prevented all sorts of accidents. Her death, in short, will let loose incalculable forces for possible ill. I am very pessimistic, he said. He did, however, find himself pleasantly surprised by Edward VII's diplomatic skills and the way in which the new king, whom he did describe as Fat Edward, Edward the Caresser, as he is privately named, he nonetheless, a month after the Queen's death, felt that the new king was managing surprisingly well and would give the country circuses, if not bread. Nonetheless, he said, I mourn the safe and motherly old middle-class queen who held the nation warm under the fold of her big, hideous Scotch plaid shawl, and whose duration had been so extraordinarily convenient and beneficent. And he concluded, I felt her death much more than I should have expected. She was a sustaining symbol, and the wild waters are upon us now. Now, he wasn't in the UK, in Britain at the time, to comment on Edward VII's own funeral 10 years later, another event also seen as a defining watershed. Here we have Edward VII's funeral procession, his horse and dog Caesar following just behind the coffin, recalled in some ways by the Queen's Shetland pony and horse, watching as her funeral procession came by in Windsor Castle as she was on her way to St. George's Chapel back in September. This too was another landmark occasion. 9 kings attended. Edward VII's close friend, Lord Esher of the War Office, wrote in his diary, "There never was such a breakup. All the old boys which have marked the channel of our lives seem to have been swept away. These 9 kings would never again be photographed together. It was the last great ceremonial occasion of the old order before World War I. And the historian Barbara Tuchman's famous account of the coming of World War I, The Guns of August, begins and ends with Edward VII's funeral. And I find myself wondering if King Charles's funeral, which of course we hope will not be for quite a few years, will mark a similar watershed, even more than that of his mother, but that remains to be seen. I'm also been thinking of 2 other momentous funerals, both of which I remember, that marked national milestones. Winston Churchill, whose death in 1966 was seen as the end of the old British Empire, and Deng Xiaoping, who died in 1997, not quite the last of the old surviving revolutionaries, but perhaps the most significant. Again, it was his death was seen as the turning of a page in history. Here we have Churchill's funeral, again, given royal honours, his gun carriage drawn by naval ratings. This did not happen with Princess Diana's funeral 25 years ago now. Cranes saluting his funeral barge. I believe cranes in China did the same during the minutes of silence to mark Deng Xiaoping's funeral. So Deng Xiaoping's funeral, I was actually in Beijing and went to Tiananmen Square when the ceremonies were being held in the Great Hall of the People to mark the death of someone who was a key member of China's founding revolutionary generation and then led China on the path of reform, opening up, and economic development. I remember how on TV at the time, my friends were watching reruns of numerous movies, the Huahe, I haven't got it right, a campaign in which he played a particularly important role. I even remember one of my academic friends saying to me that he and his son could watch these kind of war movies till they were coming out of their ears, while his wife and daughter were much less interested. But Chinese TV was taken over by documentaries and patriotic movies remembering Deng Xiaoping for several days. As with Churchill, I didn't have a sense of his death coming as a huge shock. It was more a pause for reflection. And perhaps that too was true of Queen Elizabeth's death. Well, what kind of new era does the ending of the Queen's reign portend? And I'm going to go briefly through several different, though interlinked levels: the monarchy and the royal family itself, the impact on Great Britain and on other countries where the British monarch is the head of state, the British Commonwealth, and perhaps also the global international scene, where she was respected, a deeply respected and admired figure. I think many countries would like to have had a monarch like the Queen to whom they could point as an emblem of somebody doing a job, doing it well, and becoming an internationally respected symbol of the country. Perhaps the last monarch who shared that kind of respect is the late King of Thailand. Now, in the modern world, the status and influence of the monarchy, certainly the British monarchy, is heavily dependent on the monarch's personal qualities. And Queen Elizabeth is undoubtedly a hard act to follow. It's very difficult in some ways to be the successor of somebody who is seen as having done a pretty exemplary job and done it from the time she was 25, in some ways from an even earlier age when she was the heiress presumptive to the throne, and done it for 70 years extremely well. The novelist Dame Hilary Mantel, who wrote best-selling novels about the court of King Henry VIII back in the 16th century, and who died just weeks after the Queen herself, spoke and wrote about the presence of ghosts in both her own life and in history. She almost took them for granted. Ghosts of people whom she saw, and ghosts of people and things such as the child or children she never had, that didn't happen. And I think the reign of King Charles III will inevitably be haunted by ghosts of two charismatic women, one being his mother and the other his first wife, Diana, Princess of Wales. They've left very different memories and legacies behind them. Obviously, Diana dead way before her time, the perennially wronged and unhappy wife. King Charles III does face some major personal problems, one being memories of the breakdown of his first marriage to the popular Diana. A second, his fondness for taking a sometimes impassioned stance on major political issues or issues seen as having political ramifications, including architecture and the environment. And thirdly, a certain personal self-absorption and reliance on times on poor advice and not terribly good advisors. If we look quickly at his divorce and from Princess Diana and her subsequent death, just a little after a year after their final divorce, though quite a few years after the marriage effectively came to an end. It was a wedding that had been hailed as a fairy tale romance. Well, not all fairy tales. And look at both Grimm's fairy tales and Hans Andersen. Not all fairy tales have very happy endings. This one ended as a bizarre Gothic tragedy. The couple were soon extremely unhappy together. Both unfaithful, battled each other bitterly in the media before their divorce. In summer 1997, Diana and her latest lover were killed in a stupid, senseless car crash in Paris. I remember being shocked. I was in the air when it happened, flying back at the end of the summer from the United States to Hong Kong. I came into my flat and my Filipina helper said, Princess Diana had been killed in a car crash, and I was very jet lagged, and I said, oh. And then it kind of sunk in. And I said, do you mean the Princess Diana, who was married to Prince Charles? Because she had certainly seemed very much alive and kicking, diving off yachts, having a lovely time in the Mediterranean in the previous days and weeks. And she said, yes. Her death prompted a mass outpouring of popular grief. She was 36 at the time. I would say its most important effects, however, were on her two sons, William and Harry, neither of whom has ever really been able to come to terms with losing her, each of whom has found himself a wife who, though very beautiful, in different styles, which one you prefer is very much a matter of personal taste, is certainly very much very different from his mother, though neither, I think, would want to admit that. However, Diana's death is now 25 years in the past. Memories have faded, and even though books, films, and TV series, most recently The Crown, keep on resurrecting the past, the impact is relatively limited. There were lots of advance complaints about the latest series of The Crown. I watched it and found it surprisingly thin gruel and actually pretty anticlimactic. Meanwhile, in recent years, Queen Elizabeth II has gone to great lengths to underline and strengthen Charles's position as her son and heir, praising his environmental record as following in the footsteps of that of his father, and even paving the way for his second wife to become queen rather than simply princess consort on her own death. A number of Charles's most cherished causes, most notably the environment, have become matters of national and global concern. So he actually had the good luck to be ahead of the curve on these, while stating that as king, he's going to be less outspoken on controversial issues. His son and heir, Prince William, also seems to wish to take up the torch on many of these causes. And the king's second wife has had a marked stabilizing effect on him, making him a far more contented man. Britain also faces political problems of far more significance than the royal soap opera. I myself wonder if people are terribly concerned, for example, about Harry and Meghan. I went online this morning and looked at petitions. There was one started in June of last year by one of the royal commentators, Lady Colin Campbell, suggesting that they should renounce all their royal titles. It's running at just over 90,000 signatures today. Meanwhile, petitions for other causes, for example, the former Prime Minister Tony Blair being asked to renounce his Knighthood of the Garter, which he was awarded in January of this year. That racked up over 1 million in just over a week. At the moment, the campaign, the petition to deprive Harry and Meghan of their titles is running behind a lot of petitions, including one to save Grace the ancient turtle and other ancient turtles. That's over 100,000. And another one to restore the Rosetta Stone, an important artifact in Egyptian history, to restore it to Egypt. That too is over 100,000. Neither of these great causes has featured on the front pages of the British or international press nearly as often as hate articles about Harry and Meghan. So I do feel that perhaps the British people are less interested in the royal soap opera than they are often thought to be. Meanwhile, Britain is facing much more serious political problems: the economic impact of Brexit, high inflation and the cost of living crisis, economic problems and social divisions between rich and poor, political instability within the ruling Conservative Party. Liz Truss, who met the Queen 2 days before her death, is now no longer Prime Minister. Britain's on its third Prime Minister. The reasonably competent but somewhat inexperienced Rishi Sunak for 2022, and separatism in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Constitutionally, the monarchy needs to perform a delicate domestic balancing act. It can't be too political. It has to remain out of politics, yet also maintain its relevance and its role as a unifying force in a country where by now over 10% of the population were born elsewhere. Besides the environment, King Charles's own inclinations are to maintain the union of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. He also appears to be pro-European. Way back in the 1970s, he went and established the Prince's Trust, which funds young people from deprived areas and backgrounds. And that is another cause that's been very close to his heart for over 40 years now, and for which he has raised many millions of pounds. Will he succeed in holding the UK together? One can't be sure. In the first few days of his kingship, he went and visited Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and part of the Queen's funeral rites and ceremonies were held in Scotland, where she died. It's worth remembering that the Queen herself was half Scottish. Her mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, generally known as the Queen Mum, was a Scottish aristocrat, and the royal family has close traditional ties dating back to the time of Queen Victoria, who with her husband acquired the castle of Balmoral and a huge estate up in the Highlands. they've got very close emotional ties with Scotland. I think that Scotland will probably remain within the Union, though possibly by a narrow majority. Northern Ireland, I think, is much more problematic. There are now more Catholics than Protestants in Northern Ireland, and Brexit has brought very serious economic problems in terms of the divisions between the two. So it may well join up with Ireland in the next 10 to 20 years. Wales, I think, is probably just too small to go it alone. King Charles is also king of 14 other different countries, the White Commonwealth of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, a clutch of small countries in the Caribbean, plus Papua New Guinea, Tuvalu, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific. All of these are part of the British Commonwealth, which includes 56 states, all once part of the British Empire, and 2.5 billion people. The organisation was very close indeed to the Queen's heart, and she campaigned for Charles to succeed her as its head for life, which was agreed in 2018. The Commonwealth headquarters is in London at Marlborough House, which before then was home to the Queen's own grandmother, Queen Mary, when she was a widow, and before that to King Edward VII, when he was Prince of Wales. So it's just a stone's throw from Buckingham Palace. How will her death affect the Commonwealth? Well, many Commonwealth countries have already renounced having the Queen as, and now King Charles III, having the British monarch as their own monarch. All the remaining Caribbean countries that still have the British monarch as head of state are considering removing the British monarch, and recent royal tours by both the now Prince and Princess of Wales, Prince William, and his wife, Princess Catherine, and also by the Earl and Countess of Wessex, the King's brother, have encountered serious problems. The Bahamas and Jamaica are also seeking reparations for slavery, with other Caribbean states likely to join them, together with African nations. King Charles and Prince William have both expressed deep regret for slavery, but with the British government facing serious economic problems, I think that reparations is probably not going to happen. Now, the King is planning a blitz of overseas tours of the Commonwealth over the next 2 years to try to cement his position. I suspect that Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, due to the force of inertia, will remain in the Commonwealth, will continue to have the King as their monarch, their head of state. Probably the Asia-Pacific nations, I wouldn't be surprised to see all the Caribbean nations decide that they no longer wish to have the British royal family as their head of state. King Charles is recognized as an early leader in the environmental movement. His father founded the World Wildlife Fund. His sons have taken up the cause in their different ways. And in 2021, Britain hosted COP26 in Cornwall, the Queen, sorry, I've got it wrong here. She didn't attend, but she sent a message of support. Prince William and the Prince of Wales attended. Britain is experiencing many more extreme weather events, droughts, floods, fires, etc., than in the past, plus crises over sewage, environmental pollution. King Charles and his sister Princess Anne, like the Queen before them, take particular pride in being frugal, making clothes and other things last, and repairing rather than replacing them. King Charles has 2 coats he's particularly fond of. This is one of them, a tweed coat, the other's a camel coat. He's often seen in both of them, which he's had since the 1980s. So he really does believe in make, do and mend. Over recent weeks, we've seen the saga of COP27. Chancellor Rishi Sunak, now Prime Minister, attended COP26. Here he is with a green briefcase. He wasn't going to go to COP27, but then he changed his mind. In the end, King Charles, forbidden by Liz Truss to attend COP27, contemplated sending a recorded video or Zoom message plus Prince William. At first, Rishi Sunak continued the ban, said he himself would not attend, then did a quick U-turn while King Charles hosted a reception in London for delegates on their way to COP27. The environment is going to continue to loom very, very large over the next years, decades, perhaps the next century, even longer. A real sticking point is that smaller countries and poorer countries are demanding economic assistance from the richer countries to mitigate the impact of global warming and help them cut back on fossil fuels. This became a big bone of contention at COP27. Finally, the EU has come up with some funding, but I think this is likely to be a debate that goes on and on. How much are the big countries going to pay for global warming? Summing up, monarchy depends very much on the monarch. It's a very personal role. Here is Queen Elizabeth with her predecessors. They had few formal powers, but significant influence and could help to make things happen, particularly on the diplomatic scene. Edward VII, for example, was credited with helping to bring about the Entente Cordiale with France, a country with which he had long-standing ties as Prince of Wales. He used to love going to Paris to enjoy the nightlife, meet up with lovely ladies and generally have a good time. As king, he probably continued to do so, but he also took a much bigger personal role in diplomacy there. So depending on their own particular interests and circumstances, each monarch makes something different of his or her position. The job is an exercise in soft power and influence. King Charles III and the British monarchy may actually benefit from British political disarray, with a leadership vacuum on the political front, ironically offering the monarchy an opportunity quietly to boost its position as a national and even international force on such issues as the environment. So like Edward VII, who also came to the job later in life after a very long apprenticeship, surpassed only by that of King Charles. King Charles his great-great-grandson may yet surprise everyone by what he's able to accomplish in what it's clear will be a relatively short reign. I would say somewhere probably between 15 and 20 years, though he had two very long-lived parents, so he could, like his mum, go on to 96, his father to 99, or even his grandmother, the Queen Mum, to 101. So we have to wait and see, will it be shipwreck or the sunlit uplands for the new king? But I think he does have a real opportunity here. He's also helped by the fact that despite the problems with his younger son, which I think are not as significant as they're made out to be, he does appear to have a close relationship with his older son and heir, Prince William, who is very keen to work with his father and cement his own hold in turn on the monarchy. Well, I've spoken for a bit longer than I intended, but I hope there is time for some questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Professor Roberts, and questions are very welcomed, and everyone can just fire your questions on the chat box or just simply, but you can unmute yourself to ask your question. But I think your comparisons between the funerals of Winston Churchill and Deng Xiaoping and other British monarch are very interesting and very inspiring. And but I do have a questions. Perhaps I will ask the first question is about the Commonwealth, because as you say, the Commonwealth of Nations as a organization is was very much at the heart of the late Queen, and she personally campaigned for Charles to be the head of Commonwealth. But the head of the British monarch is actually not the jury head of the Commonwealth, right? And so would you expect there will be change for the Commonwealth as an association, and can we expect in the future perhaps even the head of Commonwealth can be performed by someone other than British royal families?
Absolutely. King Charles is now head of the British Commonwealth for life. I think that the assorted leaders were so overawed by the Queen that they couldn't deny her this, because it was something that she clearly wanted very much for her son. But there is no legal reason why the next head of the Commonwealth would necessarily have to be Prince William, or indeed any other member of the British royal family. And of course, King Charles would have the option of standing down, but I don't know that he would want to. They could decide on a rotating headship, a fixed term, like the head of the UN, for example, going around different countries of the Commonwealth. There could be another deeply respected figure, such as, let's say, Nelson Mandela. We don't know what the world will be like in 10 or 15 years, who might appeal more to an organization in which the majority of the members are from Asia or Africa. So it's quite possible that some other inspirational political figure would be seen as a more appropriate leader. It's very difficult to know what the situation will be in given at least, I would say 10, maybe 15 years time, maybe even longer. We just don't know how long King Charles is going to go on, obviously, or indeed whether it will matter as much to Prince William as it did to his father and grandmother.
I'll say the king.
It could be Justin Trudeau, Jacinda Ardern, name me other inspirational Commonwealth leaders at the moment, or it could be some politician who has served his term but wants to go on and make a big difference to the world. Think Tony Blair. You can't really say a former US president because the US is not part of the British Commonwealth, but you never know.
Okay. And another of my questions is, because you mentioned a bit about the recent campaign about like returning those colonial collections from a British museum to the Commonwealth countries, like the Rosetta Stone you mentioned in the British Museum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they are calling for its return to Egypt, and right after the passing of the Queen, there are also debates about the jewelries on the imperial state crown
the Koh-i-Noor. It's actually the Queen Consort's crown, last worn by the Queen's mother, the Queen Mum, who also brought the Koh-i-Noor on her tour of the United States and Canada back in, I think it was 1938 or 39. A great worries to the Governor General at the time. I read about it in John Buchan's journal. I don't think that they'll get the Koh-i-Noor back. Dream on. There are several different claimants. The Queen Consort may not wear it in public, but they'll be damn lucky to get those jewels back. Because it's claimed by India, Pakistan, and the Taliban at the moment.
Yeah, what interests me is that, do you think this kind of cause or movements or campaigns can actually last long? Because it certainly has to do with the debate on the legacy of the colonial British Empire right after the passing of the Queen, and the debate has been sparked. But do you think this will last or evolve into something bigger, or it will just die out?
Well, let's see. The French have been returning some. I think it will depend a bit on the exact provenance, the exact circumstances. For example, the British Museum's constitution means that it cannot get rid of its artifacts, can't return them. So that probably is not going to happen. They have also, interestingly, I was reading about the Benin bronzes around the world, and other African countries are saying these bronzes should not go back to Nigeria. They were made out of the profits of the slave trade in other Africans, and they should remain where they are. They should not go back. Literally, some of the Benin bronzes are melted down made of melted down coins from slave trade profits. So other African countries which were the victims rather than profiting from the slave trade are saying, no, these should not go back. You will find that once you get into the details of these different transactions, it often becomes very difficult to sort out exactly who these should belong to.
even when we talk about like returning something to Africa and then well to where, right, to Rhodesia and because when you mean in practical terms, those things could be very complicated and not as feasible as those calling for it, right?
Yes, and also some of the African governments are not necessarily models of carefully curated, beautifully set up museums. There is an argument that at the moment many of these items are probably safer where they are. The Taliban's record with destroying artworks is not such as I wouldn't want to send anything back to Afghanistan, let's put it like that.
Yeah, but the best practice for us. Yeah. Okay. Still any questions from our audience or any questions from Wu or friends? No.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Hello,
Something wrong with my chat box. I can't write the send message.
I think chat has been disabled. I went to the chat box and it told me so.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so that's why there is no, we can't send the questions.
Like screen share, I suppose.
It should work now. And if
Yeah.
Let me see if I can actually.
Yeah, now it's okay. Now it's okay.
Now I have to try and find the right bit. Aha, here we are, chat.
Oh, Desmond, do you have any questions, Desmond?
Yeah, Desmond, I think.
I'm terribly sorry for disabling.
He's just testing the chat. Actually, we'll probably meet up at the Interchambers, Chambers of Commerce Christmas party, which I think is the end of next week.
We also should thank the Chamber of Commerce, the British Chamber of Commerce, for promoting this webinars on their Facebook page, and I delightedly found out that just now.
Yes, it was very kind of them.
Thank you very much for the publicity. Okay, and if there's no further questions.
No, I have a question. I have a question. Why the British media often have negative coverage of the King Charles?
Well, they have negative coverage of lots of members of the royal family, quite honestly. He is currently doing rather better than his youngest son. The British media, they have first one and then another royal whom they love to hate. Many years ago, they used to be very nasty about Princess Anne, who used to get herself caught speeding from time to time and was seen as being rather difficult, and had a reputation for telling journalists to naff off. That's politer than what she actually said to them. And she just ignored them and got on with her life. And now she's very much admired for being down to earth. A lot of the coverage of King Charles, particularly since he became king, has been rather favorable. So I don't think that his coverage has actually been too bad. It was pretty bloody awful, I agree, back in the 90s when he and his wife and their assorted friends were waging media war against each other. But it's improved a lot over the past 10 or 15 years. And likewise with his wife, Queen Camilla. She used to be the Wicked Witch everybody loved to hate. There's been an image makeover. And I would say too that the royal family has shown itself pretty good in handling the media, managing the media, getting friendly royal commentators on side. We've got two more comments here. Do I think the Commonwealth could break up after the Queen's death or reduce in size to just a handful of ex-dominions? I don't think the Commonwealth would do that. There's too much money involved, too much prestige. There's a secretariat, there's a lot of jobs. I think that the number of states that still have the British monarchy as their formal head of state is likely to be greatly reduced. Already it's only 15 out of 56 Commonwealth countries, and I think it could become just a handful of ex-dominions, let's say 6 or 7, by the time that King Charles moves on to the great palace in the sky. The Hong Kong handover ceremony, this featured largely, and I thought rather inaccurately, on the final episode of this series of The Crown. It really wasn't the Hong Kong people deciding they didn't want the British monarchy any longer. This was to do with the joint declaration and the fact that Hong Kong was going back to China. I'm not sure that the Hong Kong people greatly cared one way or another about the Queen and the British monarchy, though they, some of the important figures, prominent figures in Hong Kong, were very happy to pick up British titles, British medals, British honours, and so forth in the years before. I found some fascinating stuff about Stanley Ho being considered for British honours and then being considered in the early 90s when Chris Patten was governor. He was involved in various corruption scandals, considered a bit too problematic even to invite to dinner with Prince Charles, as he was then. So I think that the main thing that the Hong Kong handover ceremony did, Prince Charles was unwise enough to keep a diary, which he then circulated to his best friends, in which he referred to some of the top Chinese leaders as superannuated old waxworks or something of the kind, which was then leaked to the press by one of the people who got his diary, or somebody else saw it on somebody's desk. He really should have had more sense than to go circulating that around. But I don't think the Hong Kong handover ceremony really greatly impacted his worldview. It was just one of, he'd also attended the Rhodesian independence ceremonies and quite a number of other independence ceremonies as Prince of Wales. This was one of the jobs that was often handed over to him.
Last year,
yes, when his mum didn't feel like attending. So he's attended a good many ceremonies where the Union Jack was hauled down and independence was declared. I'm sure that he could cope with that. Now, are there any more messages?
Yeah, there is another question. Do you think there is a possibility that UK go back to EU?
I think it's possible, but it will probably be done in steps. First, by getting some kind of Swiss style or Norwegian style arrangement with the EU. ironically, UK is still part of NATO, which is, if you like, the military arm, not exactly the military arm of the EU, but a great many of the same countries are also members. So British military policy is still being very much coordinated with most of the EU countries. For example, on Ukraine, somebody else says, I sincerely hope not.
That was me.
Right, okay. Well, I think if it happens, it will happen by degrees, a bit at a time. Certainly not at one fell swoop. So really watch this space. But it will start with some kind of Swiss-style arrangement on a common market. Probably never full membership again, but trying to get some of the benefits back. Okay.
Okay.
Anything else?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So
Okay, I think that's it for our sharing sessions today. And thanks for.
is there Ray? Do you think that the Ray would like to raise a question? Hello, hello.
Hello, who?
Yeah. Said yeah. Okay, that's fine.
Okay,
Go on.
no more questions, friend?
No.
Okay, then thank you. Thanks again, Professor Priscilla Roberts, for your yet another very interesting sharing. And we very much look forward to yet another in not very impossible future. And I would like to also thanks everyone for joining. And we in the Fortunius Society will continue to host great numbers of webinars about important issues about international politics and history. But for the time being, okay, see you. Bye bye.
Okay, lovely to
Okay.
see all of you.
Okay, thanks, Priscilla. Thanks, everybody.
Not quite
Okay.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
much
you.
for attending.
Thanks,
Thank
Priscilla. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Priscilla. It's a wonderful talk and learn a lot.
Oh,
Okay.
it was fairly basic, but quite fun to do.
Good. Okay, bye-bye. See you. Keep in touch.
Okay, bye. See you, Priscilla.
Okay, I'll stop share because I don't know what this does. Bye to every if left on. Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.